Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Andrew Ibarra, and on this video, we're going to be discussing the basics of enterprise policy as code. Specifically, what is it and where does it fit into the overall governance of your Azure resources? And towards the end of this video, I'm going to be showing you where the best places to go to start using EPAC today. But before we do any of that, I want to start off by explaining the significance of EPAC, particularly why it's absolutely necessary when it comes to ensuring the security and configuration of your Azure resources. So I want you to imagine that you are the owner of a restaurant. And in this restaurant, you have two chefs that work for you and you expect them to serve your customers one dish. And what we end up seeing happening without the proper communication and guardrails in place is when the chefs go to make this dish, they might have slight variance on the dish, meaning one chef might have more ingredients than the other, or maybe a different cook time. But either way, we can think of multiple reasons why this wouldn't be ideal. From a health perspective, you might have a customer come in and order the dish once and not have any allergic reactions, but the second time they do, they're severely allergic. And additionally, maybe the inconsistency of the way the food tastes might lead to unhappy customers. And at this point, maybe you'll say, Andrew, well, as the owner of the restaurant, I feel very confident I can go and clearly communicate to both chefs the exact way I want you to make these dishes. And realistically speaking, maybe that might be possible with one restaurant, but as you start expanding from 1 to 24 in this case, the probability that you can successfully communicate that over time goes down. Maybe the chefs forget as the weeks pass what the exact way you told them was, or maybe the chefs decide that they want to start cutting corners because they realize they really need to get these dishes out to the customers as soon as possible. And even more so, as we expand from 24 to, in this case, 480 restaurants, the likelihood that you can successfully manage the expectation of these dishes, and more importantly, pass a health inspection, is practically not possible due to just the pure size of managing all of these restaurants. And at this point, this is typically where we see something like a cookbook being implemented, to where you have a centralized location of all the rules and expected ingredients that your chefs have to use whenever they go to make the dishes. And in this case, it's written once and we have a copy at the restaurant locally so that the chefs can reference it every single time they prepare the dish. And what you'll notice is as you go from one restaurant to 24 again, the size of the cookbook remains the same as it's dispersed and scaled against all the different restaurants. And this is typically where we see most restaurant owners stop. But we need to think outside of the box when it comes to our security for the restaurants and the customers. So what happens if some of the chefs decide that they want to modify the local version at their restaurant? Or better yet, what happens if some of the restaurants lose or accidentally delete the local version of their copy? Let's keep this in mind as we pivot from restaurants to Azure services. So in the restaurant, we had the centralized cookbook that we created. We disperse the local copy to the chefs at the restaurant, which they use to then create the dish. Rather in Azure, we have subscriptions instead of chefs, and Azure resources that get spun up within these subscriptions. And rather than having a local version of the cookbook, you have a policy that is originated from what? The cookbook in Azure would be EPAC. So EPAC would be that centralized location that stores all of your policies and expected configurations of your Azure resources. And again, as you expand from a few to multiple Azure resources, EPAC is scalable as you can use it to deploy different policies across all of your Azure resources. More specifically, the policies that you use to deploy against these services are Azure policies. An Azure policy is Microsoft's native solution for installing security guardrails and controls against your Azure resources to help you achieve regulatory compliance. And going back to the example of, let's say somebody within one of the subscriptions accidentally deletes or modifies a local policy. At this point, you would then use EPAC to reapply that policy to those resources. And you can do this through running EPAC through a pipeline on a hourly or 4-hour cadence and ensure that if there is any modification to those policies, that they are put back to the way that you originally intended them to be inside of the EPAC repository. So now that we know exactly the importance of EPAC, let's pivot over to understanding exactly what EPAC is. So EPAC is an open source solution used to deploy and manage Azure policy at scale. So what exactly does that mean? Think of it as a pre-packaged set of commands that you can use to take templates of policies and deploy them to your Azure environment. Likewise, that means it's not an officially licensed product or service through Microsoft, rather it's publicly available. Meaning right now you can go down to the description, visit our GitHub site, and start using EPAC today. Likewise, it's developed and actively maintained by Microsoft employees, meaning each and every code change of EPAC has to go through a strict pull request process that is reviewed and approved by Microsoft employees. The policy templates that are used inside of EPAC are JSON, and we do this intentionally because the Azure policy resources within Azure are JSON themselves. For consistency purposes, we try to keep things simple and very similar to as if you were creating a template manually inside of the Azure portal versus creating a template inside of EPAC. Additionally, the scripts that are used to deploy these templates are PowerShell, and this does not mean that you need to know PowerShell, rather you just need to know the EPAC commands to take these templates and assign them to your environment. The screenshot down below is an example of a EPAC folder structure. If you're going to be using a CI/CD pipeline for deploying Azure policy, which we'll cover on future videos, you'll have a dedicated folder for the YAML files and configurations of that pipeline. But really all that's required is the definitions folder, which has subfolders like policy assignments that have all the templates for your policy assignments, a dedicated folder for all the templates of your custom definitions, and likewise for your policy set definitions. Additionally, there is a global settings file, and this file is your main file that dictates essentially the different scopes that you want to manage and deploy Azure policy to. And I do want to highlight that there would be more advanced scenarios to where you would have additional folders, like using EPAC to manage Azure policy exemptions, and I'll be covering this in future videos. Now, how exactly does EPAC work? EPAC works by comparing what's inside of this folder structure to what's inside of your environment that you're trying to manage Azure policy. And at this point, you have two options. Option one would be to have EPAC delete anything that's not part of the folder structure. Meaning, if you have any currently deployed policy assignments, custom definitions, or policy exemptions, EPAC would delete these if they're not part of your folder structure in a templatized format. Realistically speaking, option two is always best for people first getting started, which is to have EPAC coexist with what's already deployed. Either way, there's always going to be a median part where EPAC will always stop and output the differences of what's inside of your folder structure to what's inside of your environment. Meaning that EPAC will never automatically delete or deploy any policy changes inside of your environment until you approve the changes and use the second set of commands to actually deploy those policy changes. Therefore, the overall workflow that EPAC uses is to generate a plan file throughout the first set of commands. At this point, it's going to output the differences inside of the CLI, showing you a summary of the changes that would be taking place, as well as a dedicated output file that will additionally show you all the individual changes. At that point, you would then review those changes, and then a second set of commands would be used to deploy those policies inside of your Azure environment. And you may be thinking to yourself, I have over 1,000 policy assignments and hundreds of exemptions. This is going to take me a long time in order for me to make a templatized version of every single one of those policy resources in order for me to start using EPAC. But luckily for us, we have a way to quickly export all of the policy assignments, your custom definitions, custom sets, your policy exemptions directly into EPAC templates and immediately into the folder structure so you can start using EPAC immediately. And I'll be showing how you can do that in the upcoming video. And I want to quickly wrap things up by showing you the best place to go to start using EPAC, which is going to be our documentation site. And this is going to be in the description down below, and I don't want to dwell so much into the documentation itself, but I do want to quickly recommend using the Getting Started page for learning about prerequisites such as knowledge requirements like Azure Policy and Azure Management Groups, as well as software requirements in order to use EPAC. And I do want to highlight that at the very top of every single one of the documentation pages will be a direct link to our GitHub site. And this is where we store all the publicly available code for Enterprise Policy as Code. Specifically within the scripts folder, we'll have all the core scripts that you will need to use in order to deploy the policy templates, as well as additional operational scripts, which will help you do things post-deployment, like running bulk remediation tasks or exporting compliance data of your Azure policy resources. Additionally, I highly recommend the Starter Kit folder, which contains examples of CI/CD integration with templates of YAML files for GitLab, GitHub, and Azure DevOps, as well as an empty folder structure for your policy resources if you're starting out for the very first time. And last, I want to showcase the PowerShell gallery, which has the Enterprise Policy as Code official PowerShell module, which you can use to run EPAC commands rather than having the scripts saved locally. With that being said, the very next video is going to be me walking you through installing the PowerShell module and setting up the folder structure so that you can use EPAC. And in the meantime, if you can please leave a comment on the video on any specific EPAC content that you would like to see, that would help us prioritize which videos need to be released next. Thank you so much for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.